Hi, today we're going to talk about Chapter 9, Decisions at the End of Life. And again, remember that this PowerPoint is an overview of the chapter. I really urge you to read the whole chapter on your own to make sure that you understand all of the information presented there. So here is just an outline of the chapter, and these are the main topics that we're going to hit. So the first kind of big idea is this ethical dilemma that is faced at the end of life. When do healthcare practitioners, or what do healthcare practitioners do when they're faced with a situation in which the care offered seems to have no value to the patient? So we're talking about situations where, it is pretty clear that the patient is not going to get better. What does, a healthcare practitioner do in that situation? And so what we're going to talk about here is not really, there's no one answer to this question, but there are a lot of ideas that come up. And so we're going to talk about these different ideas and also some of the legal, things that have been put into place to help patients and practitioners in this situation. So the first thing is the idea that maybe we can separate life into two different types, biological life and biographical life. And again, this is an idea. This is not something that's necessarily proven or scientific. It is just one idea. In this case, what we say is that biological life is something that all beings experience. Humans, plants and animals, anyone who is alive or any being that's alive is experiencing biological life. There is not kind of the extra stuff that comes along with what we consider being human. So then there's biographical life, and that is things that are uniquely human, like friendships and memories, weddings, graduations, all of these kind of daily activities and also special events. And so the question is, if someone can no longer participate in any of these types of activities, are they still considered alive? And the reason we get to this question goes to then the second topic, which is brain death and then persistent vegetative states. So we're going to kind of combine these and talk about these all together. So when we're talking about whether someone is alive or dead, we're also thinking about this, idea of biological life, which is like when you're officially born and when your body stops being alive. Okay, so it's like that very specific, like scientific definition. Biographical life, on the other hand, is when is it that you might stop being able to experience any kind of the typical experiences of life. So if you are brain dead or if you are in a persistent vegetative state, then, your biographical life, we would say, has ended because you're not able to experience these activities anymore. So brain death is a way for, doctors and other practitioners to decide that, someone is no longer experiencing this biographical life. So if brain death means unreceptivity and unresponsiveness, so it means that if the person is not awake and doesn't respond to anything. So if you poke them or prod them, they have no response. It means they have no movements or breathing, no reflexes, and that if you do an EEG, it's a flat EEG. And it confirms brain death along with all of these other characteristics. So in this case, nothing can be done for the patient because there's no brain activity. But this can be really difficult because for family and friends, it can look like a patient is just sleeping. And if they are on life support, so if they are getting oxygen and, that kind of stuff, if they are on machines that are keeping their body alive, then it looks like they're still alive, even though their brain is no longer functioning. Patients who have experienced brain death can be kept alive for years with the help of life support. And this link here goes to the article that is also linked in the chapter about a girl who's 13 who goes in for oral surgery and then comes out and has complications and experiences brain death, but is kept alive for years on life support. Okay, so this is one kind of category where your biological life has not ended because you're being kept alive by machines, but your biographical life, you're not able to do anything. You can't make memories. You can't make experiences because your brain is no longer, having any activity. So your biographical life has ended. But for some patients, for their families and friends, it looks as though they're still alive because they're being kept alive by machines. Another idea is persistent vegetative state. So unlike brain death, in a persistent vegetative state, the patient is awake but not aware of their surroundings. And what happens is the patient's eyes are permanently open, which suggests severe brain damage. So the patient can breathe on their own and they do have reflexes, but the chance of recovery is less than 1 in 1,000 because that state where your eyes are permanently open suggests severe brain damage. So for most people, they cannot recover from that state. Following a court case in the 1970s, people with no chance of recovering from basically the state can have their life support removed. Again, that's going to be up to the patient's family, if they have any sort of legal documents saying how they want to be treated, and there can be conflicts because some people in the family may want their life support removed and others do not. But again, a persistent vegetative state will be an example where your biological life is still moving on. Technically, you are still alive, but we would say your biographical life has ended because you're not able to participate in any activities. You are not aware of your surroundings. Next, we get to ordinary and extraordinary care. And this is really two categories for patients and families and practitioners to understand when we are dealing with people who probably will not get better. So this, is not something that is really considered, if you had like a child who just went through a car accident or something, they would do everything possible to help that patient. This is more an example of someone who maybe had, a traumatic brain injury and is in a persistent vegetative state, or someone who, has a terminal illness. So we're looking at situations where the outcome is not expected to be good. That's when we start to get into the consideration of ordinary and extraordinary care. So ordinary care is things that offer a reasonable hope of benefit and that can be obtained pretty easily. So things like antibiotics or even a blood transfusion, a surgery for appendicitis or treatment for a broken bone. Those are all considered ordinary care. Excuse me. Extraordinary care then is, these things that either they're very, very expensive or very, very hard to get, or they are not likely to help the patient. So, maybe something like, a situation where a patient has, a cancer that is not responding to treatment. Extraordinary care would be then looking at some sort of experimental treatment, or looking at, kind of a really tough course of chemotherapy that might, put the patient through a lot and not actually help them. So when thinking about ethics, it's generally accepted that ordinary care should always be given to patients, but that extraordinary care can be withheld in cases where the patient, the family, or the hospital believe it is not in the best interest of the patient. So this means that, a patient that, is in a, let's say, maybe had a traumatic brain injury and we're not sure if they're going to survive, but they have an infection. Ordinary care would mean we give them the antibiotics. That is the treatment that is accepted and it's easy to obtain and it's going to most likely cure their infection. But we probably would not give them like a lung transplant or something like that. Or we would not do kind of like heroic measures because it might, like in heroic measures in that case might be like, CPR because it's probably not going to help the patient. So ordinary and extraordinary care, it differs depending on the case, but what I want you to know is the general idea that ordinary care is, affordable treatments that offer a reasonable hope of benefit and that aren't going to cause like terrible side effects. Extraordinary care is kind of that next step. So it might not help the patient, it might be extremely expensive, or it might be that it causes the patient a lot of bad side effects. And so when we're thinking about ethics, we think that we're always going to offer patients ordinary care. But, patients still can refuse, that is their right. But extraordinary care can be legally and ethically withheld when the patient, the family, and or the hospital believe it is not in their best interest of the patient. Okay, so next is this idea of personhood. And the reason this comes up is because it's generally accepted that human beings have rights and privileges that are not held by animals and plants. So the question is, and again, this is an ethical question, it's an idea that people are thinking about. In situations where the patient is no longer fully functioning, is there a time when they are no longer considered a person with those rights and privileges? For example, if someone's in a persistent vegetative state, if we're still considering them a person, then removing life support would be killing them. But if we're saying they're no longer a person because they no longer can experience life, then removing the life support would not be an issue. And, this brings about ethical considerations, religious considerations, then personal beliefs. So it's not something that is, it's not something that is easily identified or easily discussed. Okay. So next we have advance directives. And what advance directives are is they are legal documents that help someone express their wishes before an event occurs. So for example, in an advance directive, you might say that you do not want to ever be put on life support, or that you, if your heart stops, you do not want CPR administered. So it provides, it might include a living will, which provides specific things that you want or do not want to happen. And the issue with living wills is that technology changes so quickly and that your circumstance might be different than you imagine. So it can be hard to anticipate all of the different things that you would want or you don't want. And again, this is only in the case when you're not able to communicate your wishes on your own. So if you're conscious and you're talking, then you can tell the doctors what you want or you don't want. A living will, part of your advance directive would be when you aren't able to communicate, but you still want to have a say in your care. Another thing, and probably something that's a little more useful and powerful, is a durable power of attorney. And what this is when you get to pick who you want to make decisions for you if you can no longer make those decisions for yourself. So, you may not be able to anticipate all the different medicine and technology that might be available at the point where you're not able to communicate for yourself, but you can say, I want my spouse, or I want my family member or a close friend to be the one who's going to make the decisions for me. So that again is called a durable power of attorney, because the person has the power to make decisions for you when you no longer are able to make those decisions. All of this came about in 1990 with the Patient Self-Determination Act. Prior to this law, it was very difficult for patients to put in writing or to make it clear what their wishes were in a circumstance when they weren't able to speak for themselves. So this was a way to say, we want to formalize this and give patients the ability to not only say what they would want or not want, but also pick someone who can make decisions for them if they can't make decisions for themselves. Excuse me. Next are proxy decision-making standards. And this is basically just, how do we make decisions for a patient when they can't make the decisions anymore for themselves? So the first idea is the best interest standard. And it says that whatever is the best interest of the patient is what should be done. So, for example, if a patient just needs an antibiotic to cure an infection, and it's, easy and it's not going to cause any really harmful side effects, then they should get that antibiotic. But for example, if a patient is elderly and ill, it may not be in their best interest to have CPR performed on them if their heart stops beating, because CPR can cause broken ribs, it can cause a lot of other complications, and it may not bring them back to kind of their full health. They may just be then in pain and still dying, but just you've kind of prolonged that situation. So when we're looking at making decisions for others, we want to think about their best interest. And then substituted judgment is when someone is not able to make decisions for themselves. So this is when a patient is no longer able to speak for themselves and they do not have a durable power of attorney. So now someone else has to make the decisions for them. And so typically a substitute is chosen by the court. And this person then makes decisions that's in the best interest for the patient. Informed non-consent. So we have already talked in this course about informed consent, which is that a patient needs to understand basically all the pros and cons of a procedure or medication or a treatment before they agree. Informed non-consent is when a patient decides that they've gotten all the information and they don't want to receive treatment. So a very easy example would be someone with cancer who it's not been, it's not been going well. Like they've already had one round of chemo and they still are not in remission, and they don't, they're not healthy and they don't feel like other chemotherapy is going to be successful. So here they have the right to refuse treatment. They have the right to say, I've heard everything and I've decided I don't want to have this treatment. That would be informed non-consent, when they know what they're saying and they say no. DNR, or do not resuscitate orders. This is a legal document that specifies that a patient does not want to have CPR performed on them. CPR is only performed when someone's heart stops beating and a medical professional tries to get it started again. And for some people, whether they're chronically ill or they're elderly, CPR can cause serious damage like broken ribs, and the patient's quality of life may be very poor if they are revived. And for someone who maybe doesn't already have a great quality of life, they may decide, if my heart stops beating, that means that my life is over. I don't want you to try to start my heart again. And in the process, maybe you break my ribs and I'm in pain and I'm still stuck in this hospital and not able to do anything. So Typically, people who have do not resuscitate orders also already have some sort of condition that would lead them to be medically fragile. Someone who's kind of just walking around healthy is not the typical person that gets a do not resuscitate order. Baby Doe. So this was a case in 1982, and the question came up, can patients or can parents withhold or withdraw care on behalf of their child? And, you know, here we're really thinking about then that ordinary and extraordinary care. So in 1982, a child known as Baby Doe was born with an esophageal tracheal fistula and trisomy 21, which is also known as Down syndrome. The fistula needed immediate surgery in order for the baby to be fed. So in this case, the baby was born with, you know, a deformity, and in order for that baby to eat, they had to have the surgery to fix it. And what the parents did is they decided against having the surgery because they believed it was not in the baby's best interest to survive, as he would be severely mentally disabled. And I'm sorry, that says severely. I will fix that. So the baby died because he wasn't able to eat. Half the doctors on the team agreed with the parents' decision, the other half did not. And the case really led to some question about whether this decision by the parents was ethical, and was it legal, was it okay? So as a result, the government in the United States created some regulations or rules that provide guidance on this. And they said that for disabled children, you could only withhold medical care if the patient is, or the baby is chronically and irreversibly comatose, so it means in a coma, if the treatment would only prolong dying, or if the treatment would be futile, which means that it wouldn't kind of help the child at all, or inhumane. When you're reading these, it does not seem like these parents would be able to make this decision then, because this child was not chronically and irreversibly comatose. The treatment would not prolong dying. The treatment would have saved the baby. And it would be difficult to say the treatment was futile because it would have worked, and not necessarily inhumane either. So in this case, the parents would not have been able to make that decision. Okay, organ donation. So organ donation is an ethical issue because we are looking at taking organs from one person and giving them to someone else. And we want to make sure that that's done in a way that is ethical and, you know, moral. So organ donation only became possible in the 1950s. That was the first time that organs were successfully transplanted. And the rules are that donations must always be voluntary. So it means the person, either the person has to have said prior to their, you know, death that they want to donate their organs, or the patient's family has to be willing to do it. Doctors cannot take organs from a patient, even if the patient is, you know, is brain dead, you know, if there's not consent, if the family doesn't consent, or if the patient hadn't signed something beforehand, you know, then the doctors can't take those organs. It is illegal in the US to buy or sell organs. And so even if, you know, for example, we all have 2 kidneys, and so you can donate a kidney as a living donor and be okay, but it's not okay for someone to buy a kidney. It's not okay for someone to sell a kidney. There is a severe shortage of organs available. So if you are willing to donate your organs when you're no longer need them, then you should definitely make your wishes known so that, you know, the doctors and your family know what you want. And organ donation is only done at the behest of the individual or their family. So again, it has to be voluntary. Euthanasia. So euthanasia means kind of ending life, that process of ending life. And so we think about that in terms of if you have any pets and you've ever put a pet to sleep, that is euthanasia. So for humans, it's much more complicated. There are some types of euthanasia that are legal, and then there are many other instances where it's illegal. So the type where it's legal is called passive euthanasia. And this is when the healthcare provider would withhold or withdraw life support from patients who are terminally ill or in a persistent vegetative state. So, for example, if you are on a ventilator to breathe for you and you're in a persistent vegetative state, then passive euthanasia would be them turning off the ventilator, and that would be considered okay. Active euthanasia is also known as assisted suicide, and in most states and most countries, it is illegal because it involves actions that speed up the process of dying. So, for example, someone might ask their doctor or family member to give them a lethal dose of morphine so they can end their life on their terms. And again, this might be somebody who's terminally ill or in a lot of pain. But in most places in the world, this is illegal. Now, there is some kind of wiggle room here where in the US, in some states, and there is a link there you can click on to see the specific states, doctors are allowed to prescribe lethal doses of drugs to terminally ill patients, but not actually put the drugs in their body. So the patient has to be able to be the one to put the drugs in their body. And it probably seems like kind of a silly rule to say that the doctor can prescribe the medicine, but they can't actually administer the medicine. But the people who make the laws are afraid that there would be people who would be kind of pushed or influenced into, euthanasia when they weren't wanting that. So the idea is a terminally ill patient can ask their doctor for the drug. The doctor can give them the drug, but the patient has to take it on their own. Then there is involuntary euthanasia, and this is when euthanasia is performed without the request or permission of the patient. So if, for example, a patient was in let's say they had a traumatic brain injury or some other, or they were, terminally ill, but they didn't say that they wanted to die, but that someone else gave them basically the medication to, kill them, this would be involuntary euthanasia. And the difference between voluntary euthanasia and murder is very small. So we don't ever want to do that. Okay, so this is the end. I know this is a lot of information in this chapter. Make sure to read through the chapter and look at the other resources that I provided, and please ask me questions that you have about this topic.